A lonely widow saw a teenager sleeping in her barn. Instead of kicking him out, she gave him shelter. And he gave her love. The rifle barrel glinted in the moonlight as Martha pressed her back against the barn door. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. 3 years of living alone on the ranch had taught her to sleep light and trust no one. The sound that woke her, a soft thud followed by rustling hay, could mean cattle thieves, drifters looking for trouble, or worse. She counted to 10, steadying her breathing. The autumn wind whistled through the gaps in the weathered wood, carrying the scent of dried grass and distant rain. Whatever was in her barn had gone quiet now, but Martha knew better than to assume it had left. In this corner of Wyoming territory, where the nearest neighbor lived 12 miles away and the sheriff visited twice a year if she was lucky, a woman learned to handle her own problems. The hinges creaked as she eased the door open just wide enough to peer inside. Shafts of silver light streamed through the gaps in the roof, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the still air. Her prize bull, Thunder, stood in his stall, ears pricked forward, staring into the far corner where the shadows pooled deepest. The other cattle shifted restlessly, their breathing creating small clouds in the cool night air. Martha raised the rifle, finger hovering over the trigger. She had killed men before, during the Apache raids 5 years past, when her husband Samuel was still alive and their ranch was just beginning to prosper. The memory of gunpowder and blood still visited her dreams sometimes, but it never stopped her from doing what needed doing. A soft whimper drifted from the corner, not the sound of a hardened criminal or desperate rustler, something vulnerable, almost childlike. She stepped into the barn, boots silent on the packed earth floor. The horses nickered softly at her presence, recognizing her scent. Thunder snorted and stamped, clearly agitated by whatever had disturbed his domain. As her eyes adjusted to the deeper shadows, Martha made out a shape huddled in the corner behind a stack of hay bales. Too small to be a grown man, too still to be faking sleep. The rifle lowered slightly as she crept closer. Her finger remained on the trigger. She had not survived 3 years alone by being careless, but something about the figure struck her as more pitiful than threatening. As she rounded the hay bales, moonlight fell across the intruder's face. A boy, 18, maybe 19 years old, with sun-darkened skin and clothes that had seen better months. His dark hair fell across his forehead in unwashed waves, and his breathing came shallow and quick. Even in sleep, his body remained coiled tight, as if ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. A thin scar ran from his left temple to his jawline, pink and recent. Martha studied him for a long moment. His clothes told a story: worn leather chaps, a faded blue shirt with careful patches at the elbows, boots that had walked too many miles. A working cowboy probably, though younger than most who rode the range alone. His ribs showed through the thin fabric of his shirt and his cheekbones were sharp with hunger. The rifle fully lowered now. Whatever threat this boy might pose, it was not immediate. She had seen enough desperate men to recognize one when she saw him. The question was what to do about it. Samuel would have wakened the boy with the barrel of his gun and sent him packing with a warning never to return. Her husband had been a good man, but a hard one, shaped by years of fighting for every acre of land they claimed. Martha understood that hardness. It was what kept people alive out here. But Samuel was 3 years in the ground, and she was tired of being hard all the time. The boy stirred in his sleep, mumbling something she could not make out. His hand twitched toward his hip, where no gun belt hung. Whatever trouble he was running from it unarmed and alone. Martha made her decision. She retreated to the barn door and leaned the rifle against the frame. Then she walked to the well and drew up a bucket of cold water, her movements deliberate and quiet. The ranch house sat 50 yards away, its windows dark and welcoming. She had built a good life here with Samuel, and after his death she had built an even better one alone. The ranch turned a profit. Her cattle were healthy, and she owed no man anything. But profit and independence were cold companions on long winter nights. When she returned to the barn, the boy had not moved. Martha settled herself on a hay bale 6 feet away and waited. Dawn was still hours away, but she had nowhere else to be. The sound of her movement must have penetrated his sleep, because his breathing changed, becoming more shallow and controlled. He was awake now, listening. Minutes passed. A barn owl called from somewhere in the rafters, and Thunder settled down with a final snort of disapproval. The boy's muscles remained tense, ready to spring into motion. Finally, Martha spoke into the darkness. "I know you are awake." He sat up slowly, hands visible, no sudden movements. Smart boy. His eyes found hers across the dim space, and she saw wariness there, but no meanness. That told her something important. Ma'am. His voice was rough with sleep and thirst. I did not mean any harm. I can be gone before sunrise. I am sure you can. Martha studied his face in the pale light. Question is whether you should be. He blinked, clearly not expecting that response. Most ranch owners would have already reached for their guns or their dogs. Ma'am, you look like you have been riding hard and eating light. When did you last have a proper meal? The boy's throat worked as he swallowed. That is not your concern, ma'am. Maybe not. But you are on my land, in my barn, and I am asking. A long pause. She could almost see him weighing his options, calculating risks. Finally, he said, 3 days ago. Maybe 4. Martha nodded. She had guessed as much from the hollow look around his eyes, and the way his clothes hung on his frame. Got a name? Jake Morrison, ma'am. He hesitated, then added, I am not wanted by the law, if that is what you are wondering. Good to know. I am Martha Crenshaw. This is my ranch. She stood up, dusting hay from her nightgown. You can sleep here tonight. Come to the house at sunrise and I will fix you breakfast. Then we can discuss what comes next. Jake stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. Ma'am, why would you do that? The question hung in the air between them. Martha considered several answers, all of them true in their own way. Because she was tired of eating meals alone. Because something in his eyes reminded her of Samuel when he was young and fighting his own battles. Because 3 years of solitude had taught her that kindness was a luxury she could afford. Instead, she said, because it is the right thing to do. She walked toward the barn door, then paused and looked back. There is a pump out back if you want to wash up. Clean clothes make a better impression. Jake Morrison watched her go, confusion and gratitude warring in his expression. After the door closed behind her, Martha heard him settle back into the hay with a soft exhalation that might have been relief. Back in the ranch house, she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the barn. Moonlight painted the weathered boards silver, and the mountains beyond rose like sleeping giants against the star-filled sky. This was her world, harsh and beautiful and unforgiving. She had carved out a place in it through sweat and stubbornness, and no small amount of luck. Now she was about to let a stranger into that world, and she was not entirely sure why. Martha lit the oil lamp on the kitchen table and began making plans for breakfast. Eggs from her chickens, bacon from the smokehouse, biscuits from the sourdough starter she had been nurturing for 5 years, coffee strong enough to wake the dead, the way Samuel used to like it. As she worked, she found herself wondering about Jake Morrison. The scar on his face was fresh, a knife wound probably, or maybe a broken bottle. His hands had been calloused in the right places for ranch work, but there was something else there too, a carefulness in how he held himself, as if he expected trouble from any direction. Running from something, certainly. But what? And more importantly, was he running toward something better, or just running? The sky began to lighten in the east as Martha prepared her kitchen for company. She had not cooked for anyone but herself in 3 years, and the prospect filled her with an unexpected nervousness. What if he did not like her cooking? What if he took her kindness for weakness and tried to rob her? What if he was trouble she could not handle? But beneath the worry was something else, something that felt suspiciously like anticipation. When the sun finally crested the mountains, painting the ranch in shades of gold and amber, Martha heard the soft knock at her kitchen door. She smoothed her dress, her good blue dress, not the work clothes she usually wore, and opened it to find Jake Morrison standing on her porch, hat in his hands. He had taken her advice about washing up. His dark hair was damp and combed back from his face, and he had done his best to brush the trail dust from his clothes. The scar stood out starkly against his clean skin, but it did not make him look dangerous, just young and marked by hard experience. Morning, ma'am, he said quietly. That breakfast offer still stand? It does. Martha stepped aside to let him in. Coffee is on the stove. The kitchen smelled of bacon and fresh biscuits and strong coffee. Jake stood awkwardly just inside the door, taking in the homey details, embroidered curtains at the windows, a shelf of preserves Martha had put up herself, wildflowers in a mason jar on the table. It was a woman's kitchen, warm and lived in, and completely at odds with the harsh country outside. Sit. Martha gestured to the table. Food will be ready in a minute. Jake settled into the chair across from where she had set her own place. His eyes followed her movements as she served up plates of eggs and bacon, her biscuits golden and steaming. When she poured coffee into his cup, he inhaled the rich aroma like a man who had been living on creek water and whatever game he could catch. They ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds the clink of silverware and the distant lowing of cattle. Martha found herself stealing glances at her guest, noting the way he ate with careful deliberation, as if afraid the food might disappear if he enjoyed it too much. When had he last sat at a real table, she wondered? When had he last felt safe enough to relax his guard completely? This is the best meal I have had in a very long time, Jake said finally. Thank you, ma'am. You are welcome. Martha refilled his coffee cup. Now suppose you tell me what brought you to my barn in the middle of the night. Jake's hand tightened around his cup. Just drifting, ma'am. Looking for work. In the middle of the night? With no gear? No horse? No gun? Martha raised an eyebrow. Try again. For a moment she thought he might get up and leave. His whole body tensed and his eyes flicked toward the door. But then his shoulders sagged, and she saw the fight go out of him. I was working a ranch down in Colorado. The Broken Arrow. You know it? Martha shook her head. Big spread. Thousands of head of cattle, dozens of hands. I worked there for 2 years, saved up my pay, thought maybe I could buy a little piece of land someday. Jake stared into his coffee. The foreman's son took a liking to one of the girls who worked in the main house. She did not return the feeling. Martha felt her stomach tighten. She had heard stories like this before, and they rarely ended well. He would not take no for an answer. One night he cornered her in the barn. Jake's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I happened to be there, checking on a sick horse. When I saw what was happening, you stopped him. I stopped him. Jake touched the scar on his face unconsciously. He came at me with a knife. We fought. He did not get up again. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Martha studied Jake's face, looking for signs of deception or violence. She saw neither. What she saw was a young man who had made a hard choice and was living with the consequences. Self-defense, she said finally. Try telling that to his father, or the sheriff who was the foreman's brother-in-law. Jake's laugh held no humor. I had about 10 minutes to get out of town before they came looking for me. Been riding north ever since. What about the girl? Sarah. Jake's voice softened. She was hurt, but not as bad as it could have been. I heard later that she left town too. Went to live with relatives back east. Martha nodded slowly. It was an old story in this part of the country. Powerful men doing whatever they pleased, and ordinary folks paying the price for standing up to them. She had seen it happen before, and she would see it happen again. That did not make it right. So now you are a wanted man. Now I am a man with no home, no job, and no future worth speaking of. Jake met her eyes across the table. Mrs. Crenshaw, I appreciate the kindness you have shown me, but I cannot stay. If they tracked me here, they did not track you here. Martha stood and began clearing the dishes. If they had, they would have caught you already. You covered your trail well. How do you know? Because I have been watching the horizon for 3 years, waiting for trouble to find me. I know what it looks like when someone is being hunted. She paused at the sink, hands full of plates. Question is, what do you want to do now? Jake stared at her. Ma'am, you can keep running. Head further north, maybe into Montana territory. Change your name? Grow a beard? Hope nobody ever connects you to what happened in Colorado? Martha turned to face him. Or you can stop running and start living again. And how would I do that? By staying here. Working for me. This ranch needs a good hand, and you need a place where nobody will ask too many questions about your past. The offer hung in the air between them like smoke. Jake's eyes widened, and Martha could see him turning the idea over in his mind, looking for the catch. Mrs. Crenshaw, I could not. You do not even know me. I know enough. Martha dried her hands on her apron. I know you were willing to risk your life to protect someone weaker than yourself. I know you have been riding for weeks without complaint, living rough and eating whatever you could find. I know you could have robbed me blind while I slept last night, but instead, you hid in my barn like you were ashamed to be there. She sat back down across from him, her decision made. This ranch is too much for one person to handle alone. I have been managing, but barely. Come winter, I will need help with the cattle, repairs to the buildings, cutting firewood. Spring will bring calving season, and I cannot be everywhere at once. Martha folded her hands on the table. I can offer you steady work, fair wages, and a place to sleep that is not a hay pile. In return, you work hard, keep your troubles to yourself, and help me keep this place running. Jake was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the mountains beyond. Martha could almost see the internal struggle playing out behind his eyes. Hope warring with caution, desperation with pride. What if trouble does find me here? He asked finally. What if I bring danger to your door? Then we will deal with it when it comes. Martha's voice was steady. I did not survive 3 years alone by running from problems. Another long silence. Then Jake Morrison looked at her directly, and she saw something shift in his expression. The wariness was still there, but beneath it was something new. Trust, maybe, or at least the possibility of trust. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. I would be grateful for the work. Martha felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she had not even realized she was carrying. Good. We can start today. There is a bunkhouse behind the main barn. Nothing fancy, but it has a roof and a stove. You can set up there. They spent the rest of the morning getting Jake settled. The bunkhouse had been built for Samuel's hired hands back when the ranch was smaller and needed only seasonal help. It was a simple structure. One room with a bed, a table, and a pot-bellied stove. But it was clean and private and worlds better than sleeping under the stars. As they worked, Martha found herself stealing glances at her new hand. He moved with the easy competence of someone who had been around ranches all his life, checking the condition of the walls and roof, testing the stove's draw, sweeping out months of accumulated dust with methodical efficiency. When he rolled up his sleeves to work, she could see more scars on his arms. Old ones mostly, the kind that came from working with barbed wire and unbroken horses. By midday, the bunkhouse was livable. Jake stood in the doorway, surveying his new home with an expression Martha could not quite read. It is perfect, he said finally. Thank you. You have not seen perfect yet, Martha replied. Wait until winter, when that stove is the only thing standing between you and freezing to death. Jake laughed, the first real laugh she had heard from him, and the sound was surprisingly warm. I have slept in worse places, believe me. They walked back toward the main house together, Martha pointing out various aspects of the ranch as they went. The chicken coop that needed new wire, the fence line that had been damaged in a storm last month, the well that sometimes ran low in late summer and had to be watched carefully. How long have you been running this place alone? Jake asked as they paused beside the corral where Martha's horses grazed in the afternoon sun. 3 years. My husband died of pneumonia the winter after we moved here from Kansas. Martha's voice was matter-of-fact, but Jake caught the slight tightening around her eyes. We had planned to hire more hands as the ranch grew, but plans change. Plans change, she agreed. I thought about selling after Samuel died. Going back east, maybe finding work as a seamstress or a teacher. But this place, she gestured at the rolling grassland that stretched toward the mountains. It gets into your blood. Jake nodded, understanding. He had felt the same pull, the way the big sky and endless horizon could make a man feel both insignificant and infinite at the same time. It was why he had come west in the first place, leaving behind a crowded childhood in St. Louis for the promise of space and freedom. What made you decide to stay? He asked. Martha was quiet for a moment, watching her horses crop grass in the golden afternoon light. Samuel is buried on that hill, she said finally, pointing to a small rise behind the house where a simple wooden cross stood silhouetted against the sky. I could not leave him alone out here. The simple honesty of it hit Jake like a physical blow. He had known she was a widow, had guessed from the way she spoke of her husband, but hearing her talk about staying to keep a dead man company made something ache in his chest. When was the last time anyone had cared about him enough to sacrifice for his memory? He was lucky to have you, Jake said quietly. I was lucky to have him. Martha turned away from the horses. Come on, let me show you the rest of the spread. They spent the afternoon riding the boundaries of the ranch, Martha on a steady bay mare and Jake on a borrowed gelding. The land was good. Rich grass for grazing, several streams that ran year-round, natural windbreaks formed by stands of cottonwood and pine. Martha had about 200 head of cattle scattered across the range, mostly shorthorns bred for the harsh winters and long summers of Wyoming territory. As they rode, Martha found herself relaxing in ways she had not in years. Having someone to talk to share the burden of decision-making felt like setting down a weight she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten how heavy it was. Jake was a good listener. asking intelligent questions about the land and the cattle, offering suggestions based on his experience at other ranches. More than that, he was good company. He had a way of noticing small details, the way the light fell across a particular meadow, a hawk circling high overhead, wildflowers blooming in unexpected places. It had been years since Martha had shared such moments with anyone. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they turned their horses back toward the ranch house. The day had been longer and more pleasant than Martha had expected, and she found herself reluctant for it to end. "Mrs. Crenshaw," Jake said as they rode side by side through the gathering dusk, "I want you to know how much this means to me. The job, the place to stay, all of it. I will not let you down. I know you will not." Martha's voice was warm with conviction. "And Jake? Call me Martha. We are going to be working together for a while. Might as well drop the formalities." Jake smiled. A real smile this time, not the careful, guarded expression he had worn all day. "Yes, ma'am. Martha." They reached the ranch just as the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. As they unsaddled their horses and settled them for the night, Martha found herself thinking about the day ahead. There was plenty of work to be done: fence repairs, cattle to check, preparations for the coming winter. But for the first time in 3 years, she would not be facing it alone. That night, Martha sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and watched the light in the bunkhouse window. Jake was settling in, probably going through his few possessions, maybe writing in a journal if he kept one. The sight of that warm yellow glow in the darkness filled her with a contentment she had almost forgotten was possible. She was not fool enough to think that hiring Jake Morrison would solve all her problems. He was still a young man running from trouble, and she was still a widow trying to make a life in unforgiving country. But something had shifted today. Some fundamental loneliness had eased. For the first time since Samuel's death, Martha Crenshaw was not alone. The days that followed settled into a comfortable rhythm. Jake proved to be everything Martha had hoped for in a ranch hand and more. He rose before dawn, worked until well after sunset, and never complained about the endless tasks that kept a ranch running. More importantly, he worked with a quiet competence that told Martha he had been telling the truth about his experience. But it was the small things that surprised her most. The way he automatically took on the heavier chores without being asked. The care he showed with her animals, gentling a nervous horse, or patiently working with a stubborn steer. The fact that he never tracked mud into her kitchen, always knocked before entering the house and invariably thanked her for the meals she prepared. Most of all, it was the way he listened when she talked about the ranch, about her plans and concerns and memories. Samuel had been a good husband, but he had never been much for conversation. Jake, on the other hand, seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions. He asked questions, offered suggestions, and never made her feel foolish for caring so deeply about a piece of land in the middle of nowhere. As autumn deepened into winter, their working relationship grew into something warmer. Friendship, Martha told herself, though she was beginning to suspect it might be something more complicated than that. She found herself looking forward to their morning conversations over coffee, to the satisfaction of working alongside someone who understood the rhythms of ranch life, to the simple pleasure of having another person to share the endless beauty of the land she loved. Jake, for his part, seemed to be healing in the safety and routine of ranch work. The haunted look gradually faded from his eyes, replaced by something that might have been peace. He smiled more often, laughed at Martha's dry observations about their neighbors, and slowly began to talk about his own past, beyond the trouble that had driven him north. He had been born in Missouri, the youngest of 5 children in a family that farmed wheat and corn. His father had died when Jake was 12, leaving his mother to raise the children alone. Jake had worked whatever jobs he could find to help support the family, but when his older brothers married and moved away, he had decided to head west himself. "I always wondered what was beyond the next hill," he told Martha one evening as they sat on the porch after a long day of mending fence. "Kansas was too flat, too settled. I wanted to see mountains. And now you have," Martha replied, gesturing toward the peaks that surrounded their valley. "Now I have," Jake agreed. But he was not looking at the mountains. He was looking at her. Such moments were becoming more frequent, and Martha was not sure what to make of them. There was something in Jake's eyes when he looked at her, a warmth that went beyond gratitude or friendship. It should have worried her. He was 18 years younger than her after all, and dependent on her for his livelihood. Any romantic entanglement would be complicated at best, potentially disastrous at worst. But she could not deny that she felt it too, a stirring of something she had thought died with Samuel. When Jake smiled at her across the breakfast table, when their hands accidentally touched while working with the cattle, when she heard him singing softly to himself as he went about his chores, Martha felt alive in ways she had forgotten were possible. The crisis came in late November, during the first real blizzard of the season. Martha woke to find snow piling against her windows and the wind howling like a living thing. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees overnight, and she knew from experience that the cattle would be in trouble if they could not find shelter. She dressed quickly and fought her way to the barn through snow that was already knee-deep. Jake was there ahead of her, checking on the horses and preparing to ride out to the winter pasture, where most of the herd was grazing. "You cannot go out in this," Martha shouted over the wind. "You will freeze to death before you find them. Those cattle will not survive if we leave them out there," Jake shouted back. "I have been through worse storms than this." Maybe he had, but Martha had lived through Wyoming winters long enough to know that this one was turning into a killer. The temperature was still dropping, the wind was getting stronger, and the snow showed no signs of letting up. "We go together or not at all," she declared, reaching for her heavy coat. Jake started to protest, but something in her expression stopped him. They saddled their horses in grim silence, bundled themselves in every piece of warm clothing they could find, and rode out into the storm. The next 6 hours were the longest of Martha's life. The wind cut through their clothes like knives. The snow blinded them and made every landmark unrecognizable, and the cold was so intense that breathing became painful. But they found the cattle, huddled together in a stand of trees that provided minimal shelter, and began the dangerous work of driving them toward the ranch. It was during the drive back that Jake's horse stepped in a hidden gopher hole and went down hard. Martha heard Jake cry out over the wind and turned to see him lying motionless in the snow, while his horse struggled to its feet, clearly favoring its left front leg. She was off her own horse, and at Jake's side in seconds. He was conscious but dazed, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead where he had hit the ground. When he tried to stand, he cried out in pain and collapsed back into the snow. "My leg," he gasped. "I think it is broken." Martha felt panic rise in her throat. They were miles from the ranch house, the storm was getting worse, and Jake could not ride. If she left him here to go for help, he would freeze to death before she could return. If she stayed, they would both die. Unless, "Can you hold on to me?" she asked, helping him to his feet. Jake nodded through gritted teeth. His left leg would not bear weight, but his arms were strong. Martha got him up behind her on her horse, ignoring his protests that he was too heavy, that she should leave him and save herself. The cattle were forgotten now. Survival was all that mattered. The ride back to the ranch was a nightmare of pain and cold and desperate determination. Jake's grip grew weaker as the cold sapped his strength, and twice Martha thought he had passed out completely. But each time she called his name, he answered, his arms tightening around her waist as they fought their way through the blizzard. They reached the ranch house just as Martha's horse began to stumble with exhaustion. She half-carried, half-dragged Jake into the kitchen, where the warmth hit them like a physical blow. Jake collapsed into a chair while Martha built up the fire and put water on to boil. His leg was indeed broken. She could see the unnatural angle even through his heavy pants. But first, they had to get warm and dry before the cold killed them both. Martha helped Jake out of his frozen clothes with hands that shook from cold and reaction. She had seen men die from exposure before, knew the signs of hypothermia and frostbite. Jake was pale and shivering violently, but his eyes were clear and he was still conscious. That was something. She wrapped him in every blanket she could find and fed him hot coffee laced with whiskey while she examined his leg. The break was clean, thank God. A simple fracture that would heal properly if set correctly. She had done it before, during the early days when the nearest doctor was a week's ride away. "This is going to hurt," she warned him. Jake nodded, gripping the arms of his chair. "Do what you have to do." Setting the bone was the hardest thing Martha had ever done. Jake's screams echoed through the kitchen, and she had to stop twice when her hands began shaking too badly to continue. But finally, it was done. The leg was straight and splinted, and Jake had mercifully passed out from the pain. Martha sat beside his chair for the rest of the night, monitoring his breathing and pulse, changing the cold cloths on his forehead, praying to a God she was not sure she believed in anymore. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the kitchen was warm and safe. and filled with the quiet sounds of healing. Jake woke at dawn to find Martha asleep in the chair beside him, her hand resting on his arm. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and silence. His leg throbbed with every heartbeat, but he was alive. They were both alive. "Martha," he whispered. She stirred and opened her eyes, immediately alert. "How do you feel?" "Like I was trampled by a herd of buffalo." Jake managed a weak smile. "But alive, thanks to you." Martha stood and stretched muscles stiff from sleeping in the chair. "You saved those cattle yesterday. The least I could do was return the favor." But they both knew it was more than that. Something had changed during the long night of crisis and pain and desperate hope. The careful boundaries they had maintained, the polite distance between employer and employee, had dissolved in the face of life and death. Jake would be laid up for weeks while his leg healed, dependent on Martha for everything from food to help getting dressed. And Martha would have to manage the ranch alone again, at least until spring. But neither of them minded the prospect as much as they should have. As Martha helped Jake to the spare bedroom where he would be more comfortable, their eyes met and held. There was no mistaking the look that passed between them, a recognition of something that had been growing for months, something that could no longer be ignored or denied. "Martha," Jake said quietly. Hush." She pressed a finger to his lips. "Rest now. We can talk later." But the talking, when it finally came, would change everything between them. Because in the space of one storm-filled night, employer and employee had become something else entirely. Something that neither of them had been looking for, but both of them desperately needed. Something that looked remarkably like love.